Minister Dutton, thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
Now, this is a pretty iconic speech, really, from the ASIO authorities to be giving this kind of insight into Australia's terrorism, and they've said that the terrorism threat is probable and will remain unacceptably high. That should be a real cause for concern for a lot of Australians.
It should, and I really think it's a wake-up call for all Australians. I think, like any Western democracy, we face the ongoing threat of a terrorist attack in our country. We've got young adults who are being indoctrinated online. We've got people who are returning back to Australia from the Middle East, having been schooled in the art of bomb making and the art of terrorism, and of course many of those people will pose a significant threat here in Australia. So I think full credit to Mike Burgess. I think he's been able to really shine a light on an area where people, I just think we've got a level of complacency in our country where we haven't had a major attack here. Heaven forbid that we ever do, but the likelihood, the reality is at that probable level, and I think we need to be realistic about the threat that we face.
Is it not a reflection on the government now on what it's been doing to say it's unacceptably high? Couldn't the government have done something more about it?
I think when you look at the record investment that we've made, the support that we've given now in 19 tranches of national security legislation, we'll put more legislation before the Parliament if the agencies believe that they need it. But I think the real evidence in terms of the success both of the agency and of the government, and not just ASIO but the Federal Police and the other agencies within Home Affairs, the state police forces, etc., is in the number of attempted attacks, those that have been thwarted, those that have been disrupted, and you see warrant activity on a regular basis by ASIO and the Federal Police and the New South Wales or Victoria Police or Queensland Police, for example, where they're disrupting those cells. And that's a very important part of their work. So I don't think the success is judged by how many successful incidents have taken place. Of course it's not. We need to make sure that, particularly in this crime type, we can stop an event before it happens, because as we've seen in London, in France, elsewhere, these can be devastating attacks and you can lose many people.
Now, he referenced a rise in right-wing extremism. What's causing that?
Well, again, I think the proliferation of material online, the use of technology in our lives has really transformed over the last decade for very good reasons and very bad outcomes as well. So I think the distribution of that material, the ability for networks, both on the extreme right, the extreme left, to be able to link up through the dark web, through the use of encrypted apps, that has been, I think, the catalyst for much of this perverted thought to be distributed between these groups. And ASIO, as Duncan Lewis, the predecessor to Mike Burgess, and now Mike Burgess is the Director General of ASIO, has pointed out, ASIO has been concerned with right-wing extremism for a long period of time. And I think it's important to make this point. I don't care where people are on the spectrum, right on the far left or on the far right. If they pose a threat, then they deserve the scrutiny of ASIO and the other agencies.
But he has singled out right-wing extremism as growing. Is this more of a concern now than Islamic extremism?
Well, I think he pointed out that, and it's hard to apportion, but I think he's rightly pointed out that the major threat still comes from that radical Islamic extremist element within the Australian society, but they're worried about the right-wing extreme element as well. But as I say, if somebody is on the spectrum, that is that they pose a threat to life or property, then ASIO doesn't discriminate on the basis of whether they're at the far left or the far right. The fact is that they pose a threat to Australian national security, and they'll come under the scrutiny of ASIO and the Australian Federal Police, and there'll be disruptions or arrests if that's required.
But the focus, especially from security agencies, really has predominantly been on Islamic terrorism. Does that mean right-wing terrorism has been neglected? No, I
don't think that at all. And as I say, Duncan Lewis made this point before he left office, that ASIO has been interested in right-wing extremism literally for decades. I just don't think it's manifested itself in Australia to a point, obviously, that we've seen in New Zealand with the tragedy that took place there. And I think that's probably just put it up in lights for people, but ASIO has been working on this threat for years. They'll continue to do it. It is on the rise. We do see more ASIO resources dedicated to it, and we'll stamp it out wherever it poses a threat.
He also referenced the rise in espionage, saying it's worse than at Cold War levels. What's the government doing to counter those threats?
Well, again, not just a significant investment, but the laws that we've passed to make it harder for people to act for a foreign state and to act against our national interests. So those laws have been introduced. I think the Director-General referenced in his speech last night the success of those laws, not just where the organisation's been able to act, but also the deterrence value of that legislation as well. So people have changed their tradecraft, they've withdrawn their effort. I think that's the true capacity of the agency to utilise that legislation that the government's implemented to deal with what is a very significant threat. And I think the important point that he made as well is not just the espionage, but it's the interference, as we've seen in the United States, the interference by Russia and others to try and change the outcome of a democratic process in an election. The attacks that we've seen on our systems here, including on the Australian Electoral Commission, we've got to be very conscious of that, and the influence of young minds at university campuses, for example. I mean, all of that is perpetrated by those that would seek to influence our sovereignty and to undermine that sovereignty, and that's a big part of the ASIO effort.
I mean, you reference Russian interference, but in Australia, we're talking about China, aren't we?
We're not just talking about China. I mean, we're talking about Russia, we're talking about Iran, and we're talking about others. And there are non-state sophisticated actors who are very, very heavily involved in the cyber effort, so small businesses being extorted. So there are many elements to this interference in our democratic process, on our university campuses, in businesses, in government. I think state governments have a particular role to play here, and I think, frankly, some of them up until this point in time have abrogated that responsibility with the eye firmly on profit as opposed to national interest, and I think some of that behaviour needs to change as well.
I mean, you say we're not just talking about China, but you then mention talking about profit as being a big driver. They're our biggest trading partners. They have to be the biggest concern in this case.
Well, they're an incredibly important partner for us, and in terms of trading, in terms of our people-to-people links, but whether it's China or whether it's Russia or somebody else, again, the same philosophy applies as it does in the left-wing, right-wing terrorism space. We just don't discriminate. Where we see somebody acting outside of our laws, that's the motivation for ASIO to act. And obviously, if we're seeing the theft of IP, we're seeing the influence within diaspora communities here in Australia, or we're seeing interference in an electoral process, then ASIO has the laws to act. And as the Director-General pointed out last night, there will be more prosecutions, there will be more disruptions, and in some cases it's more efficient for us to approach the embassy or to approach the government here and to have those people that we're concerned about sent back to the country of origin.
Now, the Director-General also spoke about access to encrypted messages, as you mentioned previously, and he said 9 out of 10 priority counter-terrorism cases had been damaged by lack of access to encrypted messages. Christina Keneally this morning has also come out and said that every achievement in this speech has had bipartisan support, but do you think that this backs in your position previously for pushing that encrypted message legislation?
Look, I mean, we were criticised at the time for the changes we made around the encryption laws, but I think we've been completely vindicated. I want to make sure that there are proper checks and balances in place, but I think the point that the Director-General made in his speech last night about the encryption problem that they've got that you just referenced also backs up the statements made by the AFP Commissioner, the CEO of AUSTRAC and of the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission the other day, where in child abuse matters, we've now seen child paedophile networks. I mean, it's unbearable to think about, but the messages and the videos and the content that they're distributing now online, it's all protected by encryption, and I think there is more room to move for us in this space. I think particularly the dark web is of concern to our agencies, where people are operating essentially in a corner of our lives where a warrant issued by a court can't be executed, can't be effected in that part of the world. Now, we wouldn't accept a suburb in any capital city in any country town in Australia where the police were prohibited from going to enforce the rule of law, and yet that's what we've got with encryption at the moment. So I do think there's a lot more for us to do, and if we can get the bipartisan support of Labor in that space, I think that would be very helpful.
We are having to take the ASIO at their word on this, though. We don't get access to see if this is true. We don't get access to see the lower levels of cases to see how much encryption would have helped. Is that a fair trade-off for what's a freedom for any Australian to have privacy in their communication?
Well, I think where you've got warrants that are issued by a court, that's no different to a warrant that's issued now to raid a premise or to look at somebody's bank account. The warrant's executed on the bank, and you can see the transactions that are being paid from the pedophile to the syndicate in the Philippines. We're asking for no more, no less than that. There's proper oversight of that through independent monitoring of the work of ASIO, and I think that's entirely appropriate. So where you've got a warrant that's issued by a judge and the police or ASIO can't execute that warrant, can't stop that terrorist attack from taking place, I think that's a big problem. And we've got a problem with a lot of the companies who are refusing to provide assistance. And if you're building a platform that facilitates the work of terrorism or that facilitates the work of a child abuse network, then we've got a real problem, and the companies have a moral obligation to step up. They won't tolerate the sexual harassment of women in their workplace, but Facebook does allow pedophiles to operate with the encrypted messaging on their platform. Apple does the same, Amazon and others, and somehow what they won't tolerate in their workforce, they facilitate within their business model, and I think that's unacceptable.
Minister Dutton, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Annalise. Thank you.